My name is Massimo Faggioli. I'm a professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University. I'm a church historian by formation. I came from Italy in 2008, and I've worked mostly on the Second Vatican Council, the history of the reception, but also in other areas like the New Catholic movements, and a little bit of the history of the relations between the political sphere and the Catholic Church, and on Pope Francis lately. The most important for me in the first few years was the Second Vatican Council, and that started because I graduated from the University of Bologna in 1994, and at that time, one of the institutes that were working together and within the University of Bologna was the institute that was in charge of the 5-volume history of the Second Vatican Council that was published between 1995 and 2001, and then translated in other 6 languages. And I became one of the young fellows doing archive work and other kinds of initial research in that small international, well, actually, very big international team. And so it started with Vatican II, and then it expanded in other directions because Vatican II was a big moment of discussion of all possible issues in the Catholic Church, theological, but also institutional, which was my first interest. So the history of the episcopate, the history of the local government of churches, the history of the relation between church and state. And so it started in Bologna in the 1990s. And then when I arrived in the United States 15 years later, in 2008, I developed an interest in American Catholicism, if you want, from an outsider perspective, from a European, Italian perspective. And lately I've developed an interest in the transatlantic relations in the 20th century, and most recently with the pontificate of Pope Francis, how this pontificate has reshaped the transatlantic relations between the Vatican and the United States. A very big project that I started before the pandemic, and that has been slowed down by the pandemic, is the project for a 1-volume history of the Roman Curia, of the central government of the Catholic Church. It's again one of those ideas that comes from Vatican II, because that was one of those discussions in 63, 64, 65, how to reform church government and the Roman Curia. So I started writing 2 chapters on the 20th century and on the early 20th century and late 19th century, so after 1870, after the fall of the Papal State. So I'm going in reverse, I mean, writing chapters going back. And it's a very big project because it aims at a comprehensive history, beginning with the Middle Ages until now, until Pope Francis' plans for the reform of the Vatican and of the Roman Curia. And it requires linguistic skills, because you have to have a Latin, of course, but also you have to be able to master the scholarship that has been written on the subject for different periods in Italian, in German, in French, in Spanish. So this is a long whole project that I hope I'll be able to finish before the end of this decade. So it's a very big project, but it's my dream. I've been thinking about that for so long, and finally 2 years ago I decided, and it started, and and I still have everything. I just hope to be able to go back to archive as soon as the pandemic is over. So the Roman Curia, or the central government of the Catholic Church, and the administrative apparatus around the papacy in Rome is the longest functioning government in Western history. And so we have very good studies for this or that particular period, or pontificate or century, but we do not have a comprehensive picture of what happened, especially in these last 5-6 centuries. I mean, after the Council of Trent. And so this is very important. So we need that also because, as we all know, the Vatican tends to be subject or at the center of conspiracy theories, of mythical accounts, of a lot of fictional understanding of how it works. And so it's actually it's a history of an institution, and it's very important to understand what are the relations between that model of church government and a secular model of government of the early first nation states in Europe, like France, for example, and lately in the 19th century, 20th century, how those Vatican intellectuals who thought about how the Vatican should be governed, how they were perceiving the model of the French state, for example, of Napoleon, of the modern German state, the modern Italian state. So there is a relationship between a certain modern bureaucratic way of building a modern bureaucracy and government and the Vatican ecclesiastical one. And so my formation originally is also as a political scientist and a secular historian. And you need to have this perspective because a purely theological understanding of the Vatican will lead you nowhere, or to a very limited understanding of how important it is for the history of the Western civilization, of modern politics also, to know more about the history of the Vatican and of the Roman Curia. So there's a gap, and you're right. So most of this research is in putting together and understanding what has already been written and needs just a very good synthesis, but also to see what are the real gaps, so where studies have not been done, and you really need there to do archival work and to do more basic research, because there's not much scholarship that's available already. So this is a good question, because the archival issue is an enormous one when one wants to study the Roman Curia, because it's a massive amount of paper in different archives, different congregations, and so on. So here it is really a labyrinth. So I've done already something like that when I was writing my dissertation 20 years ago in the Vatican archives, because one of the sources that I studied was the way the Vatican congregation was preparing the dossier for the appointment of bishops. And so that was interesting to see how they were thinking the government of the Catholic Church locally from the center. So there's a whole procedure. And so I started to understand how important it is to comprehend the Vatican bureaucratic mentality. And so So that is just one example, but a whole different issue arises when in the modern Vatican there's the invention of the system of government per congregation. And so there's the Holy Office, the congregation for the liturgy, for the Eastern churches, and so on. And that means that you have to have a very good plan to know where to look, because as well know, the Vatican archives are incredibly well organized, but they've also collected everything, and so it's a very massive amount of paper. And so I have already a map of where to go, and it will be essentially papers coming from these official institutions that makes discussions on how to change the structure. And the interesting thing is that most of these documents show failed attempts to reform the institution. And so it's a history of failures mostly until today. So it's not just to understand what happened in the shape of this institution, but so what kind of projects never became reality. And so this is something we know something already, because they were published decades ago, some of those projects, but this is really part of what I intend to do. So the most important thing that I think I can accomplish is to write for church historians and for Catholics, but also for a secular audience, okay? Because this is, I believe that church history has a lot to say about how our secular institutions function or don't function. So there is a striking similarity between the history of the development of the secular institutions and of the Catholic ones, especially at the central level. And so we have synods and then parliaments, we have the papacy, we have the presidencies, all of that. So this is it is beyond this project on the Roman Curia, but my goal is to make that discipline more attractive and more relevant even for other historians that tend to see sometimes in church history as a discipline at the service of a very particular audience and an agenda. And that may be true sometimes, but there is an intellectual relevance that I want to make a case for. And so it's to go beyond the usual boundaries of academia or of Catholic academia in confessional terms. And so I don't see myself as a confessional scholar, as a confessional scholar. I work with Catholic sources, Catholic issues, but not for Catholics only.